Does anybody have any questions or anything they want to mention before we move on? Yes?
In the context of your talk about compassion and right precept and so on, what about the nuns and monks who burn themselves to protest?
Okay. Yeah, I think, again, it depends on, I guess it depends on where you're coming from and why you're doing it. And I think if you do it out of anger and negativity, because you're angry either with the regime or you're angry with yourself or whatever, it's not a very good thing to do. Because anything which is done out of anger is always it always has a negative consequence in terms of karma, in terms of the future. And this is one of the great things about Buddhism. You can always, almost anything in life, you can always go back to one basic thing. What is the motivation? Why are you doing it? And from the motivation, you can always decide whether an act is good or bad. So it's impossible to tell. But if they do it with a sense that they want to, maybe they have even a sense of compassion or loving kindness. I don't know if it's possible to immolate yourself out of compassion or kindness. But if it is possible because you want to maybe show some kind of injustice to the world, if you can do it, it is at least conceivable that it might be a good act, it might be a positive act. It is conceivable. But I think it is an area where you have to be very careful, because I think it's very easy to come from the wrong kind of motivation in those kind of things. It's really a matter of motivation and intention when you do these things. Yes?
With the talk on perception, how does the perception you talk about tie into Eightfold Path right view? Because it seems very similar to me.
Yeah, that's a very good point, actually, and that's something I had intended to talk about, which I didn't mention in the talk, is that perception and view are very closely related to each other. And you'll find that in the way the Buddha teaches, he says that your view you have will tend to condition your perception. If you have a certain way of looking at the world, if this is my view, you will see the world in terms of that view. And also vice versa, if you have a certain perception of things, then that will color your view. So these things they revolve around each other. And this, for that reason, because, and of course you know that view is the foundation stone of the Noble Eightfold Path, right view comes first. So because of that, it actually, changing your perceptions also tends to change your view. It changes your view over time. Your view gradually comes around as well. So because of that, the changing of perceptions actually reinforces also the very first factor of the Noble Eightfold Path as well. So these things go together.
So the view would be more complete picture, and the perception is sort of feeding into that view.
Yeah, a view is like it's actually a kind of decision about what the world looks like. It's like, for example, in Buddhism we talk about like eternalist view, for example. It's the idea that things last forever. And this is based on your perception. Because you have a perception of a self, of I exist, I am, because of that you create the view that things are eternal. And then because you have this view that things are eternal, or maybe you think that your consciousness is eternal, or your mind is eternal, or whatever, because you have that view, you tend to perceive the world in that way. So they go around each other. So perception is more immediate, and view is more, as you say, more a kind of, you sit back and you have a certain idea about how the world actually works. But that doesn't mean that views are just ideas. Views themselves are also very solid and very kind of are things which are not something you can necessarily see straight away. And a classic example of that is the view of self. Now, people in the world will say that there is no self. There is, you can ask a psychologist, is there anything inside a human being which is a self? And the psychologist will say, no, there is no self inside a human being. And yet, despite the fact that we can have the intellectual idea that there is no self, still there is a kind of underlying feeling inside of you that there's something solid there. And that underlying feeling is also a kind of view. It's a view which is so deep that you can't even access it intellectually. It's beyond your intellectual abilities. And that is what you actually, it's that kind of view that you are challenging in deep meditation practice. It's a very deep thing.